Hey everyone, welcome to episode 15 of A Climber's Mind. I'm Matt Wright, and today I want to talk about a little bit of a life update and then some reflections I've had over the last week, and mention that I unfortunately won't be doing the guest episode with Steve McClure this week. I think Steve's pretty busy, so I don't want to pester him too much, and hopefully we'll be in contact over the next week and figure out a date and time just to record the next episode. So there's a really useful conversation that I've had this week with my mate John down at the Crag. I went to Dumbarton to meet up with him, and he's a really good friend of mine. We tend to talk about projects quite a lot and just personal life and how we're feeling about things. John is currently trying Sufferance and AA at Dumbarton Rock, and I'm trying a route very close to it called Free at Last. During this conversation, John mentioned to me that he had to distance himself from Sufferance, which I thought was very interesting because he's briefly brushed on this a few times. And quietly, behind the scenes, I've been struggling to keep the motivation going with Free at Last. Despite the fact that I've been visualising every day, I've been putting a ton of work in for it, I've been training for it, and, I feel like I have all this momentum with it physically, but emotionally there's very little kind of keeping it together. After having spoken to John, he mentioned that with Sufferance, he distanced himself from it and then he stopped visualising, and I guess he forgot the route existed for a month, or at least that's the impression that I got from the conversation we're having. And it's quite interesting because I think something that's really stood out to me is that I've always thought obsession and attachment to a route is in many ways a kind of superpower, and if you can maintain it for long enough, then, basically you can just keep putting the work in and keep going with stuff until eventually you do them. But one thing I realised more recently is that with bigger projects, ones where, there's ups and downs and really significant ups and downs, for me with Free at Last, I need to be in tip-top shape to be able to do it. I need all the stars to align. And that's the kind of thing where I'm only going to get one or two opportunities a year to be able to do that. So by obsessing constantly over it the way that I have, I've essentially burnt out, and I realised I was just putting a ton of pressure on it. So when John mentioned about distancing himself from Sufferance, immediately it grabbed my attention and really resonated with me, because I was like, actually, I think I need to do that more often with my projects. So my usual approach with a project is to just get absolutely obsessed. I'll write a training plan, I'll think about it constantly, I'll be visualising it every single day, and, I think so deeply about how I'm going to approach the climb. Whilst I'm visualising, I'm going through the moves, I'm going through the emotions, I'm going through the shapes my body's in and how that brings about certain sensations. And, I guess visualisation for me has always been such a key part of my climbing, and I see it as absolutely invaluable when it comes to learning the details of a climb and building the exact picture that you need to be able to climb something that is so limit. I guess the way I like to view it in many ways is as if the more you visualize something, it becomes more like a song that you get to really deeply know. And if you play an instrument, I've only played a little bit of bass, so I'm not an expert in music by any means. But I did learn enough from playing around with the bass that it's very, very hard to play all the chords correctly and make it sound right unless you know the song, and almost as if you're listening to the song playing in your head subconsciously as you're doing it. Whereas as soon as you start thinking about it consciously, it falls apart and it sounds bad and you can't keep up with it, and it feels like you just can't go fast enough. So processing a hard climb is a lot like playing a musical instrument, in that you need to know it subconsciously so deeply to be able to execute the very complex systems that are in place whilst you're climbing. So part of that daily visualization is just rehearsing this really deep understanding of the climb over and over and over and over again. And I see it as absolutely invaluable. But I think one thing that I've started to realise is that I think that daily visualisation and attachment to the projects that I have has become in many ways self-sabotaging, because I've essentially just not given myself the chance to relax and to distance myself from the climb, to keep the excitement alive and to make it kind of still feel like this magical thing. So a big part of what I've been realizing lately, and through this conversation with John was where it really kicked off, is that actually a little bit of distance from projects is just as important as the obsession with them. One of the major problems with Free at Last for me is that it kind of sounds weird, but it's because I live just down the road from it. I can literally walk to the crag whenever I want, and I can just go and look at Free at Last. I can go and visualize it while sat right underneath it. And in many ways, that's a blessing, and it's absolutely amazing. I honestly feel so blessed to live just down the road from this amazing crag. And obviously, like, I made that happen. I decided to move countries, and I decided to make that a reality for myself. But I hadn't realised until recently how much of a problem it is when you can't distance yourself from a climb. It's not like going to Malham or going to Raventore or North Wales, where I can look up a route, I can dream about it, I can build this magical picture in my head, and then I turn up there, I can be in awe over its amazing beauty and, you know, be captivated by the challenge ahead of me. It's not like that when I live just down the road from something. I can try it literally whenever I want. I can study the conditions whenever I want. I can visualize it whenever I want. I can sit and pay attention to it quite literally any moment I like. I could end this podcast right now, walk from my house, and in 15-20 minutes time I could be at the crag. You know, if I jumped in the car, I'd be there in 5 minutes, quite literally. And I think that's honestly really amazing. But not having that distance is making it very hard for that route to still feel magical in my mind and for me to feel that deep connection with it. So it's been very interesting to come to that realization. And when I begin to add visualization daily on top of having it so close, I'm just never able to detach myself from the experiences of the route. So it's almost as if every time I have a bad session, I just kind of carry it around with me. And it's like, kind of eats me up, because I know I'm putting all this work in and I know it's right there. And I almost feel like I should be trying it more and more and more, despite the fact that I even know in my rational mind that that's not a realistic thing to be doing. And I know this is very much a me problem, but the point of this conversation that I'm having is talking about mentally distancing yourself from goals and projects so that you can build a healthy relationship with it moving forward. And that leads me on to thinking about the difference between commitment and attachment. Commitment really helps you prepare, it helps you focus, and it helps you put the work in and maintain determination. And it also helps give direction. Whereas what I'm realizing is that attachment makes the project feel like it says something about you, as if doing that climb is going to change your life in a way that's significant, or in many ways it doesn't even make sense. It's like, you know, I'm going to send this climb and it's just going to make me happy, it's going to make me feel fulfilled, it's going to give me the recognition that I want, or, you know, all these desirable things that I imagine in my head that this route is going to give me. And, you know, I've got enough experience in climbing now to realize that, you know, you don't just send a hard route and then all of a sudden all your problems are solved. You know, I know that in my rational mind, but it's the pattern of it. It's that clinginess to a project that can quite often make it feel like it's, you know, the be all and end all of everything. And that's ultimately what attachment is from my perspective. The complicated thing between commitment and attachment is that they feel very much the same when you look at them from the outside. And I say feel is probably the wrong word to use. It's not like commitment and attachment look the same on the outside. But what I'm trying to say is that they feel different. To put it simply, commitment feels exciting, positive, and driven, whereas attachment feels heavy and it feels like everything's weighing on it. I guess the difference, it feels like you're trying to swim through syrup as opposed to water. And, you know, when you're committed, it's like, you know, you feel amazing and you feel focused. But yeah, that when the attachment starts to come in, yeah, it just makes everything a lot harder. So one thing I'm realising going back to Free at Last is that I think I need to stop trying harder with the process. I need to kind of step away a little bit. I need to stop visualising every day. And in many ways, I just kind of need the climb to disappear a little bit so that I can distance myself from it, focus on doing my training, putting the work in like I have been, but almost like quietly building momentum towards improving my physical capacity, my mental state, and my technical ability so that it all can be aligned at one stage towards doing Free at Last. Whereas at the moment, if I'm not distancing myself from it, it feels like I'm just working and, you know, testing myself on this route. But because it's not getting any closer, it just feels really intense. But because the desire is not there for me to push it on the climb anymore, it's just becoming, you know, I guess it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy where I'm putting all this work in and I'm getting nothing back. So it just feels very daunting and quite lifeless in many ways. And this doesn't have to be forever. I just need enough time away from the route just to miss it a little bit. And that's really hard to do when I just live down the road because I quite literally use Dumbarton Rock as a training venue. And whenever I'm there, I'm bouldering or I'm trad climbing, sport climbing, it's so easy for me to just like, you know, peek my head around the corner and just look up at this amazing route that I really, really do want to do one day, but currently just feels a bit too heavy for me to stay focused with. So yeah, it's a really difficult thing for me to balance, and that's what I'm starting to realise. So a big part of this is that actually the most committing thing that I can do right now towards that route is just to give it some space. So how can we link my experience with Free at Last into a wider lesson for climbers so that hopefully listeners can go away with something practical? I guess the lesson that is coming out of this is that sometimes the tools that help you can become the things that hold you back. Let's reference, you know, visualization is useful until it starts to become an attachment. Obsession is useful until it starts to become an attachment. And then the structure is really useful until it becomes too rigid. The skill in everything is noticing when these situations need adjusting and when you need to change your emotional connection with the experience that you're having so that it can stay magical and that you can continue to build momentum around something. So the answer isn't always to care more. Sometimes it's just the ability to be able to care differently, to know when it's time to try really hard and to focus, and when it's time to distance yourself and focus on maybe other things which could, in the long run, quietly improve your relationship with the project or with the goal that you're trying to achieve. I know that the podcast episode from today isn't as detailed or as polished as how they might usually be. The reality is I don't always have the answer to these things, and I think it's really important for me to recognise that I'm still learning a lot of this myself. I'm still trying to figure it out. John's comment gave me the permission in myself to see something I probably already knew if I was looking at it from somebody else's perspective, but looking at it from the outside, looking in on me, it really did spark something where I was like, John's hit the nail on the head. I need to distance myself from this climb. And that is the one thing that's going to help me feel more connected to it in the long run. You know, I can still really care about Free at Last without keeping it constantly alive in my head. and I can still be committed without being attached. And then maybe when I come back to it in, a few weeks, a few months, maybe a year, I'll have a better relationship with it. So maybe the question isn't always, how do I stay more obsessed? Maybe sometimes the better question is, would I climb better if I just let this go for a while? Thanks a lot for listening to today's podcast. Hopefully I'll do the podcast episode with Steve sometime over the next week or so, and I'm really looking forward to that chat. I think something that's quite interesting chatting to people like Steve is that he's already probably made a lot of the mistakes that I'm now making as a climber. I might have climbed at a high level relative to a lot of people, but I'm still constantly figuring these things out, and there's still lessons to be had in every project I have within climbing. So part of this conversation with Steve is just gaining a bit of an insight into the realities of somebody with a lifelong obsession with climbing, with projecting, and with different challenges that he's given himself. And maybe there's a lot for us to all learn through a master of the sport like Steve. So I'm really looking forward to this chat, and I think it's going to be really, really exciting and interesting for all of us. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.